Chapter 37. He squeezed his eyes shut when the door of the taxi closed. The first moment of relief had arrived, sweeping through his body like an adrenaline rush. It was a chance for Steve to get his head into the right place and disconnect. He had to focus on the future, and that meant relegating what had just happened again to a remote part of his brain. What was done, and it would still be done when he got back. There was no hope of making anything of the next few weeks on the road if he was carrying all that shit around with him. It was fun doing business in New York, but it was tough at any time of the year. In September, encased by the late summer's stormy warmth, the real business got done. The crowds returned to give the city an annual rebirth after spending their summer months away from Manhattan. Whether coming back from Long Beach or the Hamptons, New Jersey or further afield, come the first weekend of September and Labor Day, the whites were put away for another year, and the money was made. This was a rare solo trip to set up the next 6 months' worth of plans with the East Coast players, including his most trusted compadre, Jared. Their relationship had launched with distrust, but now it was a great one. They had quickly figured each other out, and their working relationship had flourished into a deeply significant friendship. Jared was still running the East Coast business and was always busy, but they made sure to carve out time for each other every time one of them was over. It was always the best part of every trip. For a Sunday afternoon, the 15 miles to Heathrow passed quickly. The taxi sped along the Euston Road out towards Paddington, before hitting the view of West London that the tourist buses never showed. From the A40, he gazed across the high-rise flats dominating the landscape. Huge carbuncles on the skyline housing thousands, as if London needed to feel tighter than it already did. The view introduced a fear which swept over him. His impending breakup led to a sudden fear that he was about to lose the comforts he'd found after a decade in Islington. The family home near the canal would certainly be lost to the lawyers. He suspected Greta had already started the process. Her disinterest in conciliation was obvious. He would be cleaned out and those slum flats could be his new reality. Money be fucked. That wasn't important. His sanity was. Get your head back on it, Steve. The security at Terminal 4 was more manic than a typical Sunday. Things were getting stricter, but for the experienced traveller, Heathrow was still a straightforward airport to navigate through. The most important thing was to not get into a disagreement with anybody wearing a uniform, because you can never win. Do as you're told, and you'd be through to the complimentary sapphire and tonics before too long. Solo travelling was Steve's time to relax and catch up on lost sleep, but being left alone and free of work was rare. There were always people wanting to talk to him about things and plan the next to-dos on the long list of things that were already planned to be done. He was in demand, and sometimes colleagues and opportunists travelled with him just to steal his time. But not today. He was alone, and for this journey at least, he had a few hours to switch off and disengage from his dramas. After a couple of looseners, the flight display screens changed the boarding and he went to his gate. Since the success of the Cormacs 3 years before, he'd been all over the world. The US was his second home, and the Americans went mad for the rock Celtic sound. Steve was looking after a new group picked up by the fickle American press. It was great to have a new band, but there was a fatigue in starting the process again. How many times would he go through this process in his career? Was there a natural point at which you stop hanging around with the cool kids and join the ranks of yesterday's men? Do you even know it happens? Or do you one day wake up and find you've been put out to seed, destined to promote the best of albums until you professionally die? The travel was grueling, even when he had time to rest on board. Suitcase living was a younger man's game, and he wasn't alone in being a reluctant globetrotter. Trudging towards the boarding ramp, he overheard one of his many fellow business travellers confide in his companion, "I'm not sure how many more times I can do this." Glancing around, he didn't know who it was. It could be any of them. All the faces had the same look. Maybe it was no one, and he had simply mistaken his own inner voice for one of his fellow sweaty nightcaps. Was Terminal 4 in fact London Bridge, and he was playing a character in a 21st century take of Eliot's Wasteland where each man fixed his eyes before his feet? The atmosphere weighed heavy, but a quiet flight and a nap would sort that out. Without looking up, he handed his ticket to the stewardess on the door. "Wow, Mr. Stephen Lewis, I knew I'd see you again." As it did once before in Barbados, his heart skipped a beat. He recognised that gentle voice.